Driven to Win presents The Moon of Skulls by Robert E. Howard. Chapter 6. The Shattering of the Skull. Let's begin. By thought a crawling ruin, by life a leaping mire, by a broken heart in the breast of the world, and the end of the world's desire. Chesterton. Kane wiped the cold sweat from his pale brow as he hurried down the shadowy passage. Outside this horrible palace it must be night. Even now the full moon, the grim moon of skulls, might be rising above the horizon. He paced off 100 paces and came upon the stair the dying priest had mentioned. This he mounted, and coming into the corridor above, he measured off another 100 paces and brought up short against what appeared to be a doorless wall. It seemed an age before his frantic fingers found a piece of projecting metal. There was a creak of rusty hinges as the hidden door swung open, and Kane looked into a passageway darker than the one in which he stood. He entered, and when the door shut behind him, he turned to his right and groped his way along for 500 paces. There the corridor was lighter, light sifted in from without, and Kane discerned a stairway. Up this he went for several steps, then halted, baffled. At a sort of landing, the stairway became two, one leading away to the left, the other to the right. Kane cursed. He felt that he could not afford to make a mistake. Time was too precious, but how was he to know which would lead him to the niche where the priest hid? The Atlantean had been about to tell him of these stairs when struck by the delirium which precedes death, and Kane wished fervently that he had lived only a few moments longer. At any rate, he had no time to waste. Right or wrong, he must chance it. He chose the right-hand stair and ran swiftly up it. No time for caution now. He felt instinctively that the time of sacrifice was close at hand. He came into another passage and discerned by the change in masonry that he was out of the cliffs again and in some building, presumably the Tower of Death. He expected any moment to come upon another stair, and suddenly his expectations were realized, but instead of up, it led down. From somewhere in front of him, Kane heard a vague, rhythmic murmur, and a cold hand gripped his heart. The chanting of the worshippers before the black altar. He raced forward recklessly, rounded a turn in the corridor, brought up short against a door, and looked through a tiny aperture. His heart sank. He had chosen the wrong stair and had wandered into some other building adjoining the Tower of Death. He looked upon a grim and terrible scene. In a wide open space before a great black tower whose spire rose above the crags behind it, 2 long lines of savage dancers swayed and writhed. Their voices rose in a strange, meaningless chant, and they did not move from their tracks. From their knees upward, their bodies swayed in fantastic rhythmical motions, and in their hands torches tossed and whirled, shedding a lurid, shifting red light over the scene. Behind them were ranged a vast concourse of people who stood silent. The dancing torchlight gleamed on a sea of glittering eyes and black faces. In front of the dancers rose the Tower of Death, gigantically tall, black, and horrific. No door or window opened in its face, but high on the wall, in a sort of ornamented frame, there leered a grim symbol of death and decay, the skull of Nakura. A faint, eerie glow surrounded it, lit somehow from within the tower, Kane knew, and wondered by what strange art the priests had kept the skull from decay and dissolution so long. But it was neither the skull nor the tower which gripped the Puritan's horrified gaze and held it. Between the converging lines of yelling, swaying worshippers, there rose a great black altar. On this altar lay a slim white shape. "Marilyn!" The word burst from Kane's lips in a great sob. For a moment, he stood frozen, helpless, struck blind. No time now to retrace his steps and find the niche where the skull priest lurked. Even now a faint glow was apparent behind the spire of the tower, etching that spire blackly against the sky. The moon had risen. The chant of the dancers soared up to a frenzy of sound, and from the silent watches behind them began a sinister, low rumble of drums. To Kane's dazed mind, it seemed that he looked on some red debauch of a lower hell. What ghastly worship of past eons did these perverted and degenerate rites symbolize? Kane knew that these black people aped the rituals of their former masters in their crude way, and even in his despair he found time to shudder at the thought of what those original rites must have been. Now a fearful shape rose up beside the altar, where lay the silent girl. A tall black man, entirely naked, save for a hideous painted mask on his face and a great headdress of waving plumes. The drone of the chant sank low for an instant, then rose up again to wilder heights. Was it the vibrations of their song that made the floor quiver beneath Kane's feet? Kane, with shaking fingers, began to unbar the door. Naught to do now but to rush out bare-handed and die beside the girl he could not save. Then his gaze was blocked by a giant form which shouldered in front of the door. A huge black man, a chief by his bearing and apparel, leaned idly against the wall as he watched the proceedings. Kane's heart gave a great leap. This was too good to be true. Thrust in the black man's girdle was the pistol that he himself had carried. He knew that his weapons must have been divided among his captives. This pistol meant nothing to the chief, but he must have been taken by its strange shape and was carrying it as savages will wear useless trinkets. Or perhaps he thought it a sort of war club. At any rate, there it was. And again, the floor and building seemed to tremble. Kane pulled the door silently inward and crouched in the shadows behind his victim like a great brooding tiger. His brain worked swiftly and formulated his plan of action. There was a dagger in the girdle beside the pistol. The black man's back was turned squarely to him, and he must strike from the left to reach the heart and silence him quickly. All this passed through Solomon's brain in a flash as he crouched.
The black man was not aware of his foe's presence until Kane's lean right hand shot across his shoulder and clamped on his mouth, jerking him backward. At the instant, the Puritan's left hand tore the dagger from the girdle, and with one desperate plunge sank the keen blade home. The black crumpled without a sound, and in an instant Kane's pistol was in its owner's hand. A second's investigation showed that it was still loaded and the flint still in place. No one had seen the swift murder. Those few who stood near the doorway were all facing the black altar and wrapped in the drama which was there unfolding. As Kane stepped across the corpse, the chanting of the dancers ceased abruptly. In the instant of silence which followed, Kane heard above the pounding of his own pulse the night wind rustle the death-like plumes of the masked horror beside the altar. A rim of the moon glowed above the spire. Then, from high up on the face of the Tower of Death, a deep voice boomed out in a strange chant. Mayhap the black priest who spoke behind the skull knew not what his words meant. But Kane believed that he at least mimicked the very intonation of those long-dead Atlantean acolytes. Deep, mystic, resonant, the voice sounded out, like the endless flowing of long tides on the broad white beaches. The masked one beside the altar drew himself up to his great height and raised the long, glimmering blade. Kane recognized his own sword, even as he leveled his pistol and fired. not at the masked priest, but full at the skull which gleamed in the face of the tower. For in one blinding flash of intuition, he remembered the dying Atlantean's words. Their brains hinge on the skull of Nakura. Simultaneously with the crack of the pistol came a shattering crash. The dry skull flew into 1,000 pieces and vanished, and behind it the chant broke off short in a death shriek. The rapier fell from the hand of the masked priest, and many of the dancers crumbled to the earth. The others halted short, spellbound. Through the deathly silence which reigned for an instant, Kane rushed toward the altar. Then all hell broke loose. A babel of bestial screams rose to the shuddering stars. For centuries, only their faith in the dead Nakura had held together the blood-drenched brains of the Black Nagari. Now their symbol had vanished, had been blasted into nothing before their eyes. It was to them as if the skies had split, the moon fallen, and the world ended. All the red visions which lurked at the backs of their corroded brains rose to fearful life. All the latent insanity which was their heritage rose to claim its own. And Kane looked upon a whole nation turned to bellowing maniacs. Screaming and roaring, they turned on each other, men and women tearing with frenzied fingernails, stabbing with spears and with daggers, beating each other with the flaming torches, while over all rose the roar of frantic human beasts. With clubbed pistol, Kane battered his way through the surging, writhing ocean of flesh to the foot of the altar stairs. Nails raked him, knives slashed at him, torches scorched his garments, but he paid no heed.
Then, as he reached the altar, a terrible figure broke from the struggling mass and charged him. Nakari, Queen of Nagari, crazed as any of her subjects, rushed upon the Englishman with dagger bared and eyes horribly aflame. "You shall not escape this time," she was screaming, but before she reached him, a great black giant, dripping blood and blind from a gash across his eyes, reeled across her path and lurched into her. She screamed like a wounded cat and struck her dagger into him, and then, grouping hands, closed on her. The blind giant whirled her on high with one dying effort, and her last scream knifed the din of battle as Nakari, last queen of Nagari, crashed against the stones of the altar and fell shattered and dead at Kane's feet. Kane sprang up the black steps, worn deep by the feet of myriad priests and victims, and as he came, the masked figure, who had stood like one turned to stone, came suddenly to life. He bent swiftly, caught up the sword he had dropped, and thrust savagely at the charging Englishman. But the dynamic quickness of Solomon Kane was such as few men could match. A twist and sway of his steely body, and he was inside the thrust, and as the blade slid harmlessly between arm and chest, he brought down the heavy pistol barrel among the waving plumes, crushing headdress, mask, and skull with one blow. Then, ere he turned to the fainting girl who lay bound on the altar, he flung aside the shattered pistol and snatched his skull and sword from the nerveless hand which still grasped it, feeling a fierce thrill of renewed confidence at the familiar feel of the hilt. Marilyn lay white and silent, her death-like face turned blindly to the light of the moon which shone calmly down on the frenzied scene. At first Kane thought her to be dead, but his searching fingers detected a faint flutter of pulse. He caught her bonds and lifted her tenderly, only to drop her again and whirl as a hideous, blood-stained figure of insanity came leaping and gibbering up the steps. Full upon Kane's outstretched blade the creature ran, and toppled back into the red swirl below, clawing beast-like at its mortal wound. Then, beneath Kane's feet, the altar rocked.
A sudden tremor hurled him to his knees, and his horrified eyes beheld the Tower of Death sway to and fro.
Some horror of nature was taking place, and this fact pierced the crumbling brains of the fiends who fought and screamed below. A new element entered into their shrieking, and then the Tower of Death swayed far out with a terrible and awesome majesty, broke from the rocking crags, and gave way with a thunder of crashing worlds. Great stones and shards of masonry came raining down, bringing death and destruction to hundreds of screaming humans below. One of these stones crashed to pieces on the altar beside Kane, showering him with dust. "Earthquake," he gasped, and smitten by this new terror, he caught up the senseless girl and plunged recklessly down the cracking steps, hacking and stabbing away through the crimson whirlpools of bestial humanity that still tore and ravened. The rest was a red nightmare, in which Kane's dazed brain refused to record all its horrors. It seemed that for screaming crimson centuries he reeled through narrow, winding streets, where bellowing, screeching black demons battled and died, among titanic walls and black columns that rocked against the sky and crashed to ruin about him, while the earth heaved and trembled beneath his staggering feet, and the thunder of crashing towers filled the world. Gibbering fiends in human shape clutched and clawed at him to fade before his flailing sword, and falling stones bruised and battered him. He crouched as he reeled along, covering the girl with his body as best he could, sheltering her alike from blind stone and blinder human. At last, when it seemed mortal endurance had reached its limit, he saw the great black outer wall of the city loom before him, rent from earth to parapet and tottering for its fall. He dashed through a crevice and, gathering his efforts, made one last sprint, and scarce was he out of reach than the wall crashed, falling inward like a great black wave. The night wind was in his face, and behind him rose the clamor of the doomed city as Kane staggered down the hill path that trembled beneath his feet.
Thank you for watching today's episode. The next chapter will be uploaded tomorrow. Please like and subscribe to Driven to Win for more updates.